Hi, Ms. Thomas. I'm Rob Kittredge, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I only have 10 minutes with you today, and I'm going to try and cover a fair amount of territory. So to the extent possible, if you can give me yes or no questions or yes or no answers, that would be very helpful. Obviously, answer where you have to, but if we can plow through this, that would be great. I imagine your job comes with a pretty high-level security clearance. Would it be fair to say that there's no intelligence information that Cabinet or the PM is cleared to see that you can't see?
That's true.
You attended the incident response group meetings where the invocation of the Emergencies Act was considered and regularly briefed the PM on national security issues during the period leading up to the invocation of the Act, right?
Yes.
You would know about any protest-associated acts or threats of serious violence that Cabinet, the IRG, and the Prime Minister knew about when they were considering whether to invoke the Emergencies Act, right?
As I've said earlier, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Right.
All
so I'm cleared to see everything. Right. That's different than seeing everything.
Okay. Cabinet, the IRG, and the Prime Minister were aware that CSIS had determined that the protests didn't pose a threat to the security of Canada, as that term is defined in the CSIS Act.
In the very narrow confines of the CSIS Act.
Right. Cabinet, the IRG, and the Prime Minister were aware that CSIS was concerned that invoking the Emergencies Act risked further inflaming IMVE rhetoric and could give rise to a risk of serious rhetoric. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that was a responsible act to do that analysis by CSIS.
Right. You're not aware of any acts of serious violence associated with the protests in Ottawa or at border crossings, are you?
It depends on the definition of serious violence. There was continual violence in the streets of Ottawa, but there wasn't anything that you could point to like January 6th.
And I mean, when you say continual violence, what kind of level of violence are you talking about?
As has been reported by the OPS and by the city and by the residents who have testified, harassment, people being followed, people being intimidated, the noise, the pollution, the mess.
Right, but not serious violence.
There were some incidents that were early reported, but I don't know if they, the outcome of them was directly related to the convoy participants or just the general atmosphere in downtown at that point in time.
Okay, but you can't point me to an example of an incident of serious violence.
Not serious violence.
All right. There wasn't any espionage associated with the protests or blockades, was there?
That's already been established, no.
Right. And there wasn't any sabotage?
Not as it's defined in the CSIS Act.
Right. And CSIS found no indication of foreign state interference at the protests, and you don't have any reason to disagree with their assessment, do you?
No.
Okay. Your interview summary says the National Security and Intelligence Advisor assesses intelligence and advises the Prime Minister on national and international threats to the security of Canada. When you use the term threats to the security of Canada there, that's used in a general sense and not in the restrictive sense set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, right?
It's in a broad sense.
Right. In other words, in your role as National Security and Intelligence Advisor, you're not governed by the CSIS Act.
The information I receive from CSIS is.
Sure, but your assessment of what a threat to the security of Canada isn't governed by the CSIS Act. You advise the Prime Minister on anything you consider to be a threat to the security of Canada, whether those threats meet the definition set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act or not, right?
No, that is, you're misrepresenting. I would not brief on a threat where I did not have intelligence from one of the intelligence agencies that I had thoroughly discussed with the intelligence agencies.
Right, but what you consider a threat that's worth bringing to the attention of the Prime Minister might be something that doesn't strictly fall into the limited definition of Section 2 of the CSIS Act, right?
Yes, but it would be very much consulted with the heads of those agencies.
Sure, but you're not as restricted in scope as
not.
CSIS is. Okay. In the time leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, you felt that the protests in Ottawa and at border crossings constituted a threat to the security of Canada, right?
I did.
But not in the sense contemplated in Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
Correct.
All right. In your interview summary, you say that CSIS's legal mandate obliges it to assess threats to national security through a very narrow lens. Do you remember saying that?
I do.
And that narrow lens basically boils down to the definition of threat to the security of Canada as set out in Section 2, right?
No. CSIS is restricted in terms of the threshold they have to meet in order to open an investigation, to get a warrant, and pursue collecting intelligence. There are threats to Canada that are broader than that. Foreign interference is a threat to Canada, as an example. That doesn't fall under that definition of the CSIS Act.
Okay. If I'm understanding your testimony earlier, it's your opinion that the Emergencies Act it doesn't require a Section 2 threat to the national security of Canada.
That's not what I said. I said that the public order emergency is assigned meaning by the CSIS Act, but is not restricted by the CSIS Act.
Right.
And so a public order emergency is broader than as defined by the CSIS Act.
So does a Section 2 CSIS Act threat to the security of Canada have to exist in order for a public order emergency to exist under the Emergencies Act?
Well, as we've seen, the answer to that, in my opinion, is no.
Okay. Well, I guess I'd like to walk you through the Emergencies Act and maybe see if I can persuade you that the answer is not no.
Well, as I said, you're going to receive legal arguments, and I'm not going to respond to you in terms of the legal view. You're a lawyer, I am not, and our lawyers will be making arguments.
Fair enough, but I just want to show you the section of the
I
Act,
understand. I've read the section.
And we'll see where we get it.
Well, I've read the section.
Okay, but you don't mind my showing
Sure.
it to you, I imagine. All right, Mr. Clerk, can we pull up the Emergencies Act? It's CCF 047. When did you first read the Emergencies Act?
The Emergencies Act, when I arrived in PCO.
Which would be when?
In January.
Okay. And when did you first read the CSIS Act?
I haven't, 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Can you take us to the section of the Emergencies Act that defines a public order emergency?
I think it's further down.
Section 16.
There it is.
There we go. So if we look at the definition of public order emergency, can you read that to us, that paragraph that starts with public order emergency in bold?
You'd like me to read it?
Yes, please.
Public order emergency means an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada and that is so serious as to be a national emergency.
And the next paragraph?
Has the meaning assigned by Section 2 of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act.
Right. So on a plain reading, not a legal interpretation, but on a plain reading, doesn't that say to you that the circumstances that constitute the emergency have to arise from a Section 2
Excuse
threat
me.
to the security of Canada?
The witness has already said she's not going to interpret the act. She's not a lawyer.
I mean, it's a fairly plain English reading, but I suppose.
As a lawyer, if that's all it required, you'd know we'd be out of business. So,
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right.
you have 1 minute left, and so I'm just warning you that time's running out. So
Okay,
it's,
fair enough. I guess what beyond that definition would you say is a threat to the security of Canada?
There's a range of threats that need to be considered when you're talking about this country. Economic security, the threat of IMVE, the rhetoric of threats against public figures, the inability to conduct a livelihood in the city of Ottawa, as an example, at the Coutts border blockade, if we're going to speak about this specific example. The threat to public institutions and the undermining of the confidence in public institutions. Those things all constitute a threat.
Right, but those aren't mentioned in Section 2 of the
You asked
CSIS Act.
You asked me what did, and I answered your question.
Right.
And the lawyers will talk about the CSIS
Okay, but
Act.
those aren't mentioned in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. All right, fair enough. Okay, well, thank you very much. Those are my questions.